Hello. Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Maria, for bringing me to Miami. I have never been to Miami before. This is my first time, and I don't get how you guys get anything done with this weather that you have. It's like this every day. Okay. Wait, where did I put my clicker? There it is. Okay. Okay, well, who am I? Why am I here? Why are you guys listening to me? My name is Lenny. I was at Airbnb for 7 years. I worked on a lot of different things there: conversion, instant book, supply growth, marketplace quality, superhost. Before that, I had a startup that I started in Montreal, of all places, and represent. But I'm not Canadian. A lot of people think I'm Canadian because I started a company in Montreal, but not Canadian. So we sold the company at Airbnb. I joined in 2012. Before that, I was an engineer, engineering manager, software engineer my whole life. And since I left Airbnb, there we go. Since I left Airbnb, I've been doing a lot of writing. I started putting out things that I kind of learned at Airbnb and other places that I was working at. And I put it out there a bunch of different platforms. And eventually, I started my own newsletter called Lenny's Newsletter. Very creative. And the stuff we're talking about today is all actually in that newsletter. And so you don't have to actually take any notes. You'll find everything there, plus probably 10 times more, because we only have an hour. So check that out. There we go. Why are we here? We're talking about growth, specifically marketplace growth. Raise your hand if you work at a marketplace company or started a marketplace company. Oh, wow. Okay. It's like maybe 30% of people. Why the hell are the rest of you here? I'm just joking. As you would have guessed, most of these lessons apply to any kind of company. So this is just a lens into marketplaces, and I'd say 50% is applicable to any kind of company around growth. So the talk is going to be broken up into two parts. Part one is cracking the chicken and egg problem, and part two is scaling the marketplace. Where did all this come from? So I left Airbnb and started writing about my learnings, and I found a lot of people asking me a lot of questions about what Airbnb did right and how they got to where they are today. And so I started sharing my learnings and sharing wisdom, and I had this feeling that it's dangerous to just rely on one company's experience in defining your strategy, prioritizing, things like that. So I had this desire to learn what other marketplaces did. And so I ended up interviewing founders and early growth people at 17 of the biggest marketplace companies about what worked for them. And what emerged is essentially a playbook of how to kickstart and scale a marketplace business. And so what I'm going to share with you today is the tactics, the learnings, the strategies that all of these companies used that help them become as successful as they are. A huge shout out to all these folks that helped contribute to this. This would be nothing without all of the insights and learnings and honestly the time that they gave to help me with this thing, and the transparency that they had into like what actually worked is pretty inspiring, and I was amazed. And I think honestly a lot of the innovation that we see in tech, in the technology industry, comes from this culture of sharing and giving back, and this is a really good example of that. So huge shout out to all these folks. And you'll see a lot of quotes and stories from all these people. So before we dive in, three things I just want to cover to set a little bit of a foundation. What is a marketplace? Why are marketplace businesses interesting? And a few disclaimers. So what is a marketplace business? For the benefit of this presentation and the way I think about marketplace businesses, there's essentially three parts to a marketplace. One is they connect to demand, which are essentially people that want a thing, with supply, which are people that have that thing, and it leads to a financial transaction. So examples of marketplace companies, Airbnb connects travelers to people with homes, Etsy connects people that make handcrafted goods to people that want to buy those things, and TaskRabbit connects people that have needs in their home to professionals that can help them, like electricians. Two, why are marketplace businesses interesting? Why are investors really excited about marketplaces? And why do people want to start marketplace companies? There's three reasons that I've kind of identified. One is they have built-in network effects, which are a really powerful moat and just a way to build a business. And all that means is the more users you have in your business, in the product, the cheaper and better it becomes. And so as people join, it becomes easier and cheaper for everybody in the service. And then that leads to number 2, which is they're a strong barrier to entry. It's hard to replicate a marketplace once you've got it up and running. And then because they have no inventory and they're just connecting supply and demand, and they don't have to buy all the supply, they're really efficient, really scalable, and really flexible. So for example, Thumbtack doesn't have to hire 1 million plumbers all around the world to scale globally. They just find 1 million plumbers that already exist. And then 3 disclaimers. So one is kind of the foundation of all of these companies is that they actually had really good product market fit. And all the things I'm going to talk about are ways to accelerate growth on top of that and to control growth. But you're not going to be able to follow step 1, 2, 3 and then have a $1 billion company. It's important that you actually solve a problem for people that is important to them. So that's just one. 2 is these are all interviews on the past, what happened for them in the past. Things change. Growth channels change, and so don't assume that if you do what somebody did, it's going to work exactly the same way. And then 3, this is all based on interviews and memory, which we all know is faulty. And so there may be flaws in this, but I will say I did my best to triangulate everything that everyone shared with me across multiple people at a company, and I looked at comparable companies to see if they were doing similar things, and I feel really good about where all this landed, and I stand behind all these things that we're going to share today. But I just wanted to point these out. Okay, phase 1, cracking the chicken and egg problem. Why are we talking about chickens? I thought we were talking about marketplaces. So what is the chicken and egg problem? If you're starting a marketplace business, this is often what it feels like. So to start a marketplace, you have to get a lot of things right. You got to do a lot of things and get them all working. For example, you have to get supply and demand almost at the same time, because without supply, why would demand come? Without demand, why would supply join? For example, say you're starting DoorDash. How do you convince a user to download your app and check it every time they're hungry before you have any restaurants on the platform? And how do you convince restaurants to change the way they do their ordering and train their staff and onboard to your service before you actually have anybody that you're sending them? So that's a classic challenge of a marketplace. How do you get both sides working? And it's called the chicken and egg problem. Which came first, and how do you solve this problem? So one of the more interesting takeaways from this research is essentially 4 steps that emerged from the research of how all of these marketplaces crack the chicken and egg problem. And essentially, they all went through these 4 steps, essentially in this order. So I'm going to go through what each of these steps are. Step 1 is constraining your marketplace. Let me see at the next slide. Okay, yeah. So constraining your marketplace is around creating a minimal viable marketplace, kind of the smallest possible marketplace, so that you can get it working and create a flywheel and figure out what the product is. And there's 2 ways to constrain it. There's a constraint around a geography, and then you can constrain around a category. And so how do you know which one to constrain your marketplace by? It's pretty simple. I find that if the service requires physical interaction, if you have to like pick up food or get in a car or stay at home, you can constrain it geographically that way by focusing on one market. If you can't do that, then you can constrain it by category. So a couple examples with geography, Airbnb started in New York. And with category, Etsy started just with handcraft goods. And so I'll talk through a bunch more examples. Oops. Okay, so here's how all of these companies essentially constrain their marketplace. And there's one exception that's really interesting that I'll talk about. But so one takeaway here is 70% of companies constrained their initial marketplace by geography and the rest by category. And then Thumbtack consistently is a weird one. And they're always an exception. And I'll talk about them. And so we're going to talk through a few examples. So let's start with geography. Rover, they started in Seattle, and as you can see, they hyper-focused in Seattle and stayed in Seattle until they felt like they actually figured out what they were doing. And it was a good city for them because Amazon is a big employer there, and they're very dog-friendly, and so they saw it as a perfect city for figuring this problem out, and helped them figure out what they were doing. Instacart, similarly, they picked markets where they expected a lot of demand, specifically, say, Chicago in the winter. Nobody wants to go outside to buy groceries. And so they started in those markets, and that was where they picked to go first. And then OpenTable found that to get a market working, they needed 50 to 100 restaurants in a concentrated area for it to be a market that's working. And so they focused on one initial city, got to that, and then moved on to the next city. So that's geography, and then a few examples of category. Eventbrite focused on just tech events and mixers initially. And TaskRabbit focused on handyman tasks and house cleaning and moving help. And honestly, behind the scenes on this quote is they actually wish they actually focused more. They actually were still a little too broad. And one of their learnings is we should have focused even more. And eventually, I think they pivoted to just, furniture, IKEA furniture assembly. And then they got bought by IKEA. And then this last example, Thumbtack, super interesting. So they kind of realized, that because of their specific type of business, they thought that they had to go wide, both on category and geography, because how often do you need a plumber? And how often do you need an electrician? And their feeling was, to get people using this product over and over and over, we need all the different services that you ever need, and let's just go nationally while we're at it. And it took them 4 or 5 years, I think, to crack the problem and to actually get to a working marketplace. So it worked out for them. But I think, honestly, they probably would have been a lot more successful if they started with a geographic constraint, maybe a few category constraints, but it worked out. They brute forced it, is the way they described it. Okay, so that's constrain. So you figure out how to constrain your marketplace, step 1. Step 2 is you figure out which side of the marketplace to focus on. So I skipped ahead a little bit here, but essentially you decide, do I focus on supply or do you focus on demand? And 100% of companies picked one or the other. So that's a learning. And as you can see, 80% of companies focused on supply. So a takeaway there is most likely you're going to want to focus on supply initially when you're building a marketplace. So a few examples, Lyft, supply growth, no question, was an unlock for them, and they knew this from the beginning. DoorDash, they essentially looked at how companies like them start, and it always starts with restaurants and getting more supply because they drive demand, and so they focused on supply. And then Thumbtack looked at all of the biggest marketplace companies out there. So they looked at Amazon and eBay and Craigslist, and their takeaway was, what are they doing consistently across the three? And they found 1, they had all the supply, and 2, they didn't really care about brand or product. And so they realized, let's just focus on getting all the supply and we can come back to the product later. And that's what they did, and it worked out. On the demand side, there's only 3 companies in the ones I talked to that found that demand was the constraint, and they're all very unique. Rover found that they had no problem with supply. And if you look at their value prop, which they talk about here, it's a pretty cool value prop. $50, have a dog over for 1 night, anytime you want, you decide if you want them or not. So it's a compelling value proposition and meaningful money, and it's really flexible, and so they had no problem getting supply. And Zillow, as another example, they bootstrapped their supply off existing data that existed around homes. So they didn't have to convince anyone to sign up. They just kind of had it from the beginning, and then they built their estimates on top of that, and then they got people to list their homes on Zillow later. So they focused on demand. A really interesting example and story that came out of this is Patreon, who realized that they're not actually a marketplace as they were building both sides of the marketplace. They kind of realized that they're better off just being a SaaS tool for their creators. And what they did is they took the demand side off their roadmap, and it ended up being a huge win for their company. And so this is just something to think about, is as much as you want to be a marketplace and as much as your supply wants you to drive them more demand, you may not have a problem that you're solving for the demand side, and so you may not actually be a marketplace in the end. So it's something to think about. So, okay, we've constrained the marketplace. We've picked which side of the marketplace to work on, probably supply. So the next step is you drive supply and demand. So let's talk about how to drive supply. Okay, so these are the 12 most common growth levers that all of these companies used across supply growth, and I hid the first 3. Can anyone guess what some of the top 3 initial supply growth levers might be? Just shout it out. SEO. What was that? Referral? Nope. Look, it's further down. Okay. Okay. That's essentially right. Social media. What was that? Digital marketing. I bundled that under performance marketing, which very low. Sharing codes? It's like referrals, so nope. Okay, that's a good guess. What was that? Fake? Oh, fake. Interesting. Okay, so that I bucket that under subsidizing supply a little bit, but this like light is shining in my face, so I can't see everyone. But that gentleman guessed the number one, which I labeled direct sales. So direct sales was the biggest lever by far across all these companies, which surprised me. I thought it was going to be like performance marketing or SEO or viral loops, and it turned out it's just sales. And so 60% of companies use sales as their primary growth lever. A couple other interesting learnings here. We're going to talk about all these in a couple examples, but let's see. So single player mode stood out to me. That's something, I don't know if you guys have heard of what this is. I'll talk about it in a little bit, but I thought it was going to be a lot more common, this idea of building a single player mode for the supply side. I was also surprised performance marketing and SEO was really low on the spectrum for supply growth. And it changes on the demand side, and it changes later when we're talking about scaling, but I thought that was really interesting. So I'm going to go through a few examples of these. So direct sales, 10 of the 17 companies relied on direct sales to kickstart their supply growth. Airbnb, which you wouldn't think it was a direct sales-driven company initially, was very direct sales-driven. That's a quote from an international expansion guy named Georg. And then OpenTable, they kind of walked around restaurant to restaurant with their servers under their arm, walked into restaurants, pitched them on their product, and set it up for them. So that's direct sales. So piggybacking, what this is essentially piggybacking off of an existing platform or network that people are already using for solving that problem. So in this case, it's essentially always Craigslist is what I find. Everyone's just piggybacking off of Craigslist. Poor Craigslist. Just all these companies being built on their back. So Uber, as you can see, goes straight to Craigslist to get their drivers. Airbnb, allegedly, not confirmed, before my time, solicited people on Craigslist that were renting their home and got them to switch to Airbnb. I wasn't there for that. The third most common lever is referrals, something I worked on at Airbnb, and I love a good referrals program. And so it was the third most common lever across all these companies to drive early supply. And so Lyft, double digits of their supply came from referrals. Uber, a third of their trips, and Caviar was a big lever. Someone said word of mouth. So word of mouth was the fourth most common way that people heard about supply. So OpenTable, restaurants talk to each other. So it was a really powerful kind of viral loop across the restaurants in a market. Eventbrite, 36% of their supply came from word of mouth. And then Patreon, creators follow creators. So whatever other people are doing, people end up doing. And then a few more. Subsidizing supply, that's kind of what that gentleman mentioned. And so Lyft and Uber both did this. They paid drivers initially to be supply, and they just paid them a salary, and that was a good way to bootstrap supply. And then Breather made their rooms really nice. I don't know if you guys know Breather. It's a meetings on demand kind of startup. And then single player mode. So single player mode is a really cool tactic that I was actually surprised more people didn't do. And what it means is you build, so the marketplace you need both supply and demand. What if you could build a tool just for one side of the marketplace before the other side is there? And that's called single player mode. So what OpenTable did is they just built an amazing reservation system for restaurants that they just use to book tables without anything else, without any demand coming at them. And with that, they got a bunch of restaurants on board. And then they were able to drive demand to those restaurants. And so initially their sales pitch was 90% reservation system, 10% we're going to drive you demand. And then it slowly switched to mostly demand driving. And then again, performance marketing, only used by Uber and Lyft across all these 17 companies early on for supply. And then SEO, only Eventbrite used it as an effective lever early on. So super interesting, I thought. Another interesting takeaway is, so there's 12 levers that came out of this research. The average number that each individual company used was only 2.5, and the median was 2. So a takeaway there is that even though there are many ways to grow supply, probably there's going to be just a few that work for you. And so learning there is don't try to do them all. Just pick the ones that seem to be working and double down on those, because it's unlikely you're going to find a ton of things that are working really well for you. So don't just do all these 12 and assume it's going to work out great. Okay, so we constrained the marketplace. We picked which side to work on. We have supply working. At some point, you have to get to driving demand. And so again, here are the 12 most common levers that companies used. Don't take a picture of this one because I'm going to give you the answers, and it's going to be a lot more useful. Okay, who can guess one of the top 3? And the first one's tricky. Shout it out. Subsidies, okay. What was that? Any other guesses? Free trial, okay. Network effects. I put that under loops actually, but so it's in there. Social media. Free money. That's just PayPal. And piggyback off of them. You might be right. Okay. Not one of the top 3, but that's a good idea. PR? The App Store? Nope, but good guess. So the answers are, word of mouth is by far the biggest driver of growth for all of these companies, which is really amazing. And to me, that just reaffirms how important product market fit is, that drives a lot of product market, a lot of word of mouth. So word of mouth, 2, is a really interesting tactic that I hadn't even thought about, which is supply driving demand, and I'll talk about what that means, and then SEO. So unlike on the supply side, SEO is actually a really big lever on the demand side. And then let's see what else is interesting here. So PR, somebody said PR, surprisingly very common, the 5th most common lever, and for a number of companies it was the #1 lever. And then loops is really interesting, we're gonna talk about that. So word of mouth, Lyft, the pink mustache was a really important lever for them to drive a lot of word of mouth. Open Table, as they say here, it started with word of mouth. And then Airbnb, so I joined in 2012, and I think in 2014 we finally measured where growth was coming from. And the learning was that 50% of growth was coming from word of mouth. And so we all thought we were doing amazing, everything's going great. And it turns out it's just like people are talking about it, and that's how we're growing. And on the host side, it was 70%. So that was pretty cool. So that's word of mouth. So supply driving demand, this is really interesting. This essentially means that your own supply brings the demand to the marketplace. So for example, at DoorDash, they get a restaurant on board. Then they start marketing, hey, download DoorDash to order food delivery. And people download DoorDash, and then they order from other restaurants. And this worked for 7 of the companies that I talked to. And so if you can pull this off, it's a really incredible growth lever because they do all the work for you. Similarly, Etsy, their sellers drove demand. Eventbrite, same thing. Eventbrite, you create an event, kind of like this event. You sign up for Eventbrite, and then you send it to all these people, and that drives people to Eventbrite, and then they check out what else is happening. So that's a really powerful lever if you can get that. SEO, again, unlike on the supply side, it was really popular on the demand side. 7 of the 17 companies I talked to. Yeah, this is a funny story. The founder of Thumbtack was sitting at a bar, sat next to this guy that happened to be a world expert at SEO. And the founder's like, what's SEO? And he told them, and he ended up joining their board and helping them figure out SEO. And now it was 80 to 90% of their growth. So maybe go out to some bars. Yeah, let's go after. And Grubhub, similarly, 30% of their new users came from SEO. It was their #1 lever. Quote by Casey Winters, who I know was at one of these events not long ago. Performance marketing, unlike, again, on the supply side, it was actually really powerful on the demand side. And so Breather, I just used this quote because it was really interesting. Julian, the founder, found a way to kind of hack Twitter ads by, instead of using them to drive followers and retweets, he used his own personal account where it's like his face and just Julian, and his ad was, hey, we're launching in New York. Message me if you want to check it out. And he got thousands of people messaging him, and he just manually onboarded them all and walked them through the 7-step funnel that he kind of concocted on his own. And Twitter ended up calling him into their office because the ad was performing so well, because he was getting all these DMs, and he ended up costing him only a penny per click because it was converting so well, because they'd never thought of using it this way. And so that was kind of what hockey stick to growth for them. So a kind of a reminder to think outside the box. PR, important for 6 of the companies, and these two were essentially relied on PR as their #1 growth channel. TaskRabbit, and Zillow. And loops are, somebody mentioned kind of viral kind of sharing as a tactic, and that's what this is. And so what you want to create here is a way to kind of get supply to drive demand, to drive supply to drive demand. And so at Grubhub, again, Casey built this loop where they get all these menus, they convert traffic to book at the restaurant, then they go to the restaurant, hey, we're getting all this traffic, you should sign up. And then they sign up, and then they get more demand. So that's effective for a number of these companies. Okay, so that's the 4 steps. Constrain, concentrate, supply, demand. That was a lot of information, so I'm going to give you a chance to rest your brain for a moment. Okay, that doesn't work. What does that say? Oh well, all right, there's going to be a funny video. It's okay. We'll keep going. Get those brains working again. No rest for the weary. Okay, phase 2. So you've kickstarted the marketplace, you've got a flywheel going, you feel like it's time to expand. So the way that I structured phase 2 is around the 4 most common questions that I get from companies that are scaling and trying to grow. So number 1, how do I know if I'm supply or demand constrained as I scale? 2 is what works at scale. So we talked about all these early growth levers, but what actually works when you try to grow past kind of the chicken and egg stage. 3, how do you maintain quality? And 4, a question asked everybody. If you did it again, what would you do differently? And that has some of the most interesting stuff, so we'll get to that. Okay. How do you know if you're supply or demand constrained? So first of all, what is being constrained on supply and demand? It essentially means which side is keeping you most from growing. So if you added an additional batch of supply or demand, which is going to kickstart growth more, which is keeping you from growing. A lot of times, if you add one side of the marketplace, nothing happens because you already have enough of that. You have enough restaurants or you have enough taskers on TaskRabbit, and there's no benefit. And so it's important to know which side you should be concentrating on. And here's how it broke out across the companies that I talked to in their later stage. And so 40% found that they're always supply constrained. So that's really easy. They're always working on supply. 20% found they're always demand constrained, and then the rest were somewhere in between, and that's the most interesting one. So I'll go through a few examples. Always supply constrained. So DoorDash, similarly to when initially they found that restaurants were the key, later on they found the same exact thing. Anytime they looked at what is slowing growth and what will help us grow faster, it was always more restaurants, more supply. So they always focus on there. Uber, Andrew Chen shared how they essentially didn't even think about supplier demand imbalance. They always knew if they had more cars, they're going to get more bookings and trips. OpenTable, same thing. Always demand constrained. TaskRabbit essentially had a wait list of people that wanted to become taskers, and they started charging a fee to even become a tasker because they had so much supply. And so they knew that demand was their biggest issue. And so the last bucket is the most interesting, is when you don't know, and it changes by category or by market. And so what happens is everybody builds a model or a heuristic or some kind of metric that tells them which side to focus on. So a few examples, Grubhub, Casey again, they sorted all of their markets by 2 things. What percentage of restaurants in the market, say what percentage of restaurants in Miami does Grubhub have online? And then how many orders does each restaurant have? Orders per restaurant. And they sorted that to find which restaurants are in the higher percentiles and focused on those markets to drive supply. At Thumbtack, they took a different approach. They basically found that when a user has less than 3 results in their search, they're looking for a plumber and they get 1 plumber in a market. Once they hit 3 results, their happiness on NPS score goes up significantly. And so they set a goal of just make sure we have at least 3 results in every search, and that became their big goal. And then at Airbnb, here's a quote from me, because nobody gave me this quote, so I just wrote it. This is how we thought about it. So initially, we focused on occupancy rate. So if a market, say Miami, was at 70% occupancy, that meant that it was supply constrained, that the rest of the stuff no one's going to want to book anyway. So that was a threshold we set. And then we've changed that, and then we've started looking at, okay, where does conversion drop in a market? So in some markets, once you're at 50% occupancy, conversion drops, and that tells us that's a supply constrained threshold. And so that became a goal per market. And then now there's a very sophisticated model that tells us which is going to drive more revenue. And then this is just like a cool story. How did surge pricing get invented at Uber? This GM in Boston was having trouble getting cars at 3 a.m. on a Friday. And so he just like sent an email to all the drivers. And it's just, we're going to double your payments if you drive at 3 a.m. And it worked really well. And other GMs copied it, and then they ended up building it into the product. Okay, number 2. What levers work at scale? So this is how it broke out. A couple interesting takeaways just looking at this high level. There's a lot less levers that people use. And where this comes from is, initially you do things that don't scale, but eventually you got to scale the things you're doing. And not everything's going to scale. And so that reduces the channels that you can use to grow supply. Also, performance marketing, number 1 at this point. So eventually everybody essentially gets into performance marketing. That was super interesting to me. Let's just go through each of these. Oops, there's that rocket. So performance marketing at Uber, 50% of their growth comes from performance marketing now. And in Zillow, they added it later in their history and it became a huge lever. By the way, one caveat, I'll go back one. This is a combination of supply and demand. I kind of combined them just to keep this simple and not turn this into 3 hours of talking. So just keep that in mind. So 2 is expanding geographically. This wasn't a lever early on because you start in one market, but it turns out once you're scaling, expanding geographically is a really big way to grow. So at Instacart, it was one of their main levers. At Grubhub, it was one of their top 2 or 3 levers when they wanted to grow. 3, conversion, just optimizing the funnel, making it easier to use your product. So at Etsy, they removed a lot of friction early on, and then at Zillow, there was a big focus of theirs, and that made a lot of impact. What's interesting here is that how many companies it wasn't a huge lever at. You would think conversion would be a huge opportunity at every sort of company, but it turns out it wasn't. 4, SEO. So OpenTable came to it late. It was a big success for them once they got to it. And a lot of companies came to a lot of these levers late, but once they got to it, it worked out. So that's a takeaway, is you don't have to do all these things initially. You can kind of keep things in your back pocket and get to them later. Referrals, the 6th most common lever as companies scale. Another quote by me. It was a big part of our both supply and demand growth at Airbnb, 10 to 15%, and at Uber, similarly, 15%. And then just a fun quote from Go Cool at Caviar, that there's a sense that there's going to be like one silver bullet that does everything and you win and you up and to the right and you're a unicorn. But in reality, a lot of these cases, there are a lot of lead bullets, just regular. And just keep shooting, and things start to add up. Don't shoot anyone. Okay, 3, how to maintain quality. So this is something that I care a lot about because I worked on quality at Airbnb for a long time. And so I was really curious how folks maintain the quality of their marketplace. As you scale, it becomes really hard. So these are the tactics and strategies that folks use to maintain quality. So let's just go through a couple of them. The most common is essentially just setting a standard of quality and kicking people off or warning them if they're falling below that. So a classic example, Uber, if you're below a certain % star rating, you get kicked off. The second most common, we did this at Airbnb for sure, is just onboard manually your initial supply and kind of get them aware of what the hell you're doing, walk them through it, talk them through it. And so the early folks at Airbnb had a 12-point checklist that they used that told people what your photo should look like, how to set your price, how your description should look, and help them become successful early on. And companies like DoorDash and Caviar still do it, as far as I understand. They still walk restaurants through everything. I skipped a few, and I'll just show a list of all the rest I'm skipping. But search ranking is a really interesting lever for quality. As you can see, Rover kind of looked at it as a way to control everything that's happening in the business. And the way you use this, you essentially demote low-quality stuff and promote high-quality stuff, and that leads to the high-quality stuff getting booked. And so search ranking is a really interesting lever to use. A really fun story here is you can find early signals of quality, and it takes time to figure this out. So an example, TaskRabbit gave their supply kind of a mini Myers-Briggs test to figure out their personality type, and then correlated certain personality types to being successful on TaskRabbit. And when they came on board, they focused on those folks more. And another example, Rover, they found a question that they could ask in their flow that if they answered a certain way, they're more likely to be a great dog walker. And the question is, where does the dog sleep at night? And if you answer, in my bed, that tells you that they're going to be a really good dog walker / dog boarder. Isn't that amazing? Yep. It's not for everyone. And then just like a really fun quote from DoorDash. Who knew that French fries and buffalo wings are this kind of white whale in the food delivery business, getting them hot and crispy. Very hard, turns out. And then the last part, I asked everybody, what would you do differently if you could do this all over again? And the number one takeaway was everybody wished that they'd focused more. This is just one example of that. Breather had this feeling they wanted to be a lot of things. They wanted to build this big consumer brand and do a lot of things for people. But in the end, they realized that they're just like an on-demand meeting company. And their learning was we should have just realized that early on and just focused on that more. 2 is to be more aggressive. This came up a lot. This is a quote from Grubhub is, you would think that all these food companies are already spending a lot of money, but his regret is we should have spent more because they could have done a lot better. This is a great story around thinking longer term. So OpenTable had this restriction on their app initially where you had to be an OpenTable restaurant to show up in the app because they wanted to use that as a carrot to use OpenTable. But it turned out Yelp won the demand side of that because they had everything. And so if they thought ahead, if they realized, hey, we should be the app everyone goes to for everything and not just the things that are that we have on the back end, they could have been like the go-to app for going out. And so looking back, that was kind of a strategic decision that may have bit them in the butt. There's a learning about just leveraging data sooner. This is a lesson for us all. They had most of their company at Etsy apparently working on a part of the product that drove like 700 bookings a day. And then they had like a few people working on the part of the product that drove 100,000 bookings a day. And part of this is that I don't think they knew what was going on there. And they didn't look at their data as much as they should have. And so they missed a huge opportunity. And then a fun story here is just Lyft sharing the story about how they wish that they had more empathy for their drivers. They kind of pushed them to do things that were important to the business and to help them understand why they're doing certain things from a customer perspective. And so that's something that came out from Lyft. And then Rover shared this story where Rover started as a dog boarding company. And then there's always this idea of, hey, we should do dog walking. What if we do dog walking? And they always kind of push that off. Let's get to that later. And then WAG came around, and WAG is doing really great. And so they kind of missed the opportunity to be what WAG is today. And so they regret not getting into that earlier. And I think the key here is that it's like the same customer base, the same infrastructure, and it was even better economics because it's like more frequent. You don't need to board your dog often, but you can walk them a lot. And so that was a big opportunity that they missed. And there's a lot more. You could check the newsletter for all these things because there's so many. So, summary. Phase 1, crack the chicken egg problem. Figure out a way to constrain the marketplace, pick which side to focus on, figure out how to drive supply, and then figure out how to drive demand. And then phase 2, figure out how to know if you're supply constrained, figure out which levers make sense for you as you scale, maintain your quality, and then don't make all these mistakes that all these guys made. So next, for this kind of body of work, there's a phase 3 that I'll put out at some point, which looks at kind of the evolution of marketplaces, specifically moving to managed marketplace, where you have a lot more control over the supply. It's kind of a trend in marketplaces. There's a lot more in the newsletter, so check that out. And then I think we're going to move into Q&A. That's it. Thank you. How should we do Q&A?
Okay, I'm going to come to you with the mic because we were recording this, so please wait, and I'm in heels, so give me some space, some time. Any questions?
Hi, I'm Jacqueline.
Hello.
I have a lot of stuff on my lap, so I'm not going to stand up. That was a lot of strategy, and it's great. Thank you so much. One thing I'm wondering is, can you tell me anything about who? You told us a lot about what, but who are the people that are going to do these things? Like, who do I want on my team? That could be titles, or that could be skill sets.
What I think about in all these questions is just, is there anything different from a regular startup in a marketplace? And honestly, I don't think there's anything different you would do to start a marketplace company from just a general company, tech company. So I guess to think about it broadly, it always starts with the founders. I guess a few questions you could ask, and I don't know if there's anything specific you're thinking about, is like, do you need a growth person? Do you need a product manager early? What kind of functions do you need? So I'd say the way I think about startups is everyone's a growth person. Doesn't make sense to just hire like a person that's doing growth early on at least. So my advice is don't just hire a growth person. And then maybe the question is, I don't know if you were asking about product managers, but that comes up often is like, when do you hire your first product manager? And I guess the way I think about it is it's once the founders just don't have time to do the product part of the business, and they need someone else to take that on so that they can work on other things. Is there anything specific you're thinking about in terms of roles?
Well, especially, so right now it's just me, pretty much, and I'm wondering who to bring on, and does it make sense to have like a CIO and a marketing manager, regardless of what roles that they do, like there's going to be a lot of overlap, but who are the first skill sets to bring on?
In a startup?
Yeah.
Focus on people that actually do concrete, deliver product things, like engineers or designers or sometimes data scientists. That's what I would definitely focus on, is just people that can like create the thing so that you could learn what you should be building and iterate quickly on it versus like outsourcing to engineering or something like that. So avoid like a top-heavy bunch of strategy folk that sit around and think and strategize, and you just want people to get stuff done.
That helps. Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you. Hey, Lenny. Thanks for the talk. I have several questions. Sorry, I don't want to hit you in the head here. But the biggest question on my mind right now is related to the growth question. All these companies, the 17 companies that you interviewed, they're virtually household names, at least household for this crowd. So my question to you is, what would you say is your upper bound of marketplace growth for supply and demand constrained startups when it comes to being and remaining a net good for the communities they serve? So for instance, Uber has been in the media a lot, getting a lot of PR lately, and not necessarily for the good things. They're seen right now as being so big that they're exploiting their workers. So, ultimately we're not all trying to buy the moon. We're not Jeff Bezos. So when do you stop growing and just maintain a focus on the people that you're serving? Especially a company that interacts with, human beings, that's their supply side.
Yeah, I'd say just living in a capitalist environment, companies are almost pushed to grow, especially if they want to be a public company. And so I think it's challenging to build a company and then kind of stop thinking about growth. It's just kind of pushed upon you. And I don't know if any companies that just kind of like, okay, we're done growing, let's just stay where we're at. I don't know if that works in just like the system that we're in, the economic system.
Stopping growth, because you do still have to have a certain level of maintenance for return, but just, plateauing. Like if, starting a marketplace business was working out, you hit a plateau at like 200 pounds, you stop.
Yeah, but I think that connects to just like if you don't have a future where you're going to grow, you basically start to fail. That's just like, I think the way it works. Like there's not a world in the public markets where just like, okay, we're good and we're not going to grow anymore. We're just going to keep the way things are. So I think maybe the way to think about it is a lot of these companies have to like do crazy stuff to get to a certain point, and then they try to address all the issues that all the problems they've caused, which ideally they don't cause all those problems from the beginning. But I think honestly that it all comes from like the pressure that they get from the public and the governments and cities, and so you almost have to force them to do the things that are necessary. It's not going to come innately in a lot of cases.
So what I'm hearing here is that it's
That is one way to solve that problem. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because there's a pressure that comes along with that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for the presentation. It's been great. I was actually want to ask you, when do you think is a good time to raise capital for this type of business? If there is any difference when compared to other type of startups, and which do you think are fair valuation metrics for a marketplace startup?
So a question around when is the good time to raise capital? I think similar to other startups, there's kind of like the idea stage when you just have a cool idea that could inspire people to what it could be with a strong team. That's one great time to raise capital early on. And then once you have a product, you need to show that there's some traction, that it's working. And so if you've missed kind of the idea phase, you want to get to a place where you're showing there's a reason to believe this is going to work. And so in a marketplace, the metrics that you want to look at often are, one of them is what people call fill rate, which is the percentage of people that come to your site that end up having a successful time. And that's a sign that the marketplace is starting to work. So that's a milestone in a marketplace, is when you show some level of liquidity that's actually working. And then I forget what the other part of the question. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Other questions?
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you for all that. That was incredibly informative. So building on these two questions, marketplace obviously is the chicken or the egg, as you've shown us. So it seems like it would take double the amount of money to sort of get it to a place, which means that you're going to run out of money twice as fast. So the funding situation, how do you actually get to having enough money to get it to where you have enough money? And without, like, if you go out and get funding, do you need just traction? Do you need revenue? Do you need to be revenue positive? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it takes double the money, because if you think back to the second step of cracking the chicken and the egg, a lot of it is you concentrate on one side. So you don't actually have to build both sides at the same time, especially if one side drives the other side. So it's not necessarily going to be so much more money. But in terms of like what investors want to see in a marketplace, I think it's just there needs to be a reason to believe this is going to work, and that you have some concept of cracking this problem. And there's a few ways to do it. One is kind of this fill rate of what percentage of people coming actually end up getting booked. Another is a lot of times it's just like qualitative examples of this thing doing something really interesting. It reminds me, there's two things people look for in a marketplace is frequency of use and the dollar amount that they're spending. And so even just coming up with an idea of a marketplace that has high frequency of use and it's a high dollar amount, even if it's just high frequency of use and it's not a huge dollar amount, that's often a really good opportunity in a marketplace. So even just pointing to this, like, here's a big problem that we can solve. And really, if you think about marketplaces, really, they're just like any other business that are solving a problem, and the marketplace is a way to solve it in essentially a cheaper way. And so in the end, it always just comes back to, are you solving a problem for people? Are you solving it in a way that you can build a business on top of? And if you can, then investors will be excited about that.
Are any of the companies that you showed us self-funded?
I think a few of them were probably started bootstrapped, and then they all raised money. Uber was in Shark Tank? What? I didn't know that. I don't know. Allegedly, Uber was on Shark Tank. Okay, I don't remember that. So I have this little cheat sheet here that I'm just going to look at to see if anyone was bootstrapped real quick. I know Thumbtack had a lot of trouble raising money for a long time, but I know they raised from Jason Calacanis at some point. So they weren't that early. Yeah, I think maybe AngelList, but it's pretty rare. I don't know. These are all juggernauts, and so I don't know if they're the best examples of.
Sequoia. Jason was the Sequoia.
Oh, the Sequoia Scout, right? That's right.
Your company, Airbnb brand that you almost went bankrupt.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they had to pay the rent. But then they got into YC. Yeah. So I think, yeah, that's right, with their cereal.
Hi, I'm Anna Ruiz.
Hello.
Hi. So I have a show called Analytical Beat. It's about tech startup, entrepreneurship, and social digital media in South Florida. And we've talked a little bit about, quite a bit about social ventures here in Miami. And I just wanted to point out maybe that's the kind of solution that we would try to strive for marketplaces to grow with different measurements of growth, not just economical measurements, right? So if your marketplace maybe addresses another issue, it's creating another way to measure impact, right?
Yeah, like in the end, it has to make money for it to be a business. But there's a company I'm advising called Ren, that is with a W, and they connect regular folks that want to offset their carbon footprint. And so they calculate your carbon footprint, and then they connect you to a project that offsets that carbon. And it's kind of tapping into, I think, a little bit of that.
Yeah. So aside from that, I wanted to point out, I'm assuming you included, when you say word of mouth, right? I don't know how conventional that is. Like, am I talking about word of mouth of like me talking to another person or me talking to another person online, which is probably more common. And in that sense, I was wondering how you address the word of mouth phenomenon of social media, because honestly, that's essentially what it is. But I didn't see it portrayed in any significant manner in any of the data you presented.
Yeah, word of mouth is just you hear about a product through somebody else, like wherever you see it. You could see it on Facebook, you could see it on Twitter, you could get it in person. It's just like not getting an ad, not getting talked to about it by the company. That's kind of the broad spectrum of word of mouth.
I guess what I'm trying to say is specifically for social media's impact on the growth of these companies, do you have any specific data you can share?
So I'd say social media, the way I see it is it breaks up into performance marketing, Facebook, Google ads, and people just posting things on Facebook and Twitter. And so I think there's probably a segment of the word of mouth that comes from just people seeing things on Twitter and Facebook. And nobody highlighted that was like where they got most of their growth. I think it's kind of a combination of all the ways that people hear about stuff.
Yeah, I just found it curious that SEO was different than performance marketing, which I thought was the thing. But either way, like I imagine that at the time that these companies were growing, social media wouldn't have the impact that it would have on a company starting today.
Yeah. I think a lot of these relied on social media in a lot of different ways.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, let me go him and then Arvin.
Hi, Lenny.
Hello.
Thank you so much for sharing tons of value right there on that presentation. I took pictures of everything.
How's your brain feeling?
But quick question. As part of your research, did you ask about how big of a pilot these companies ran as they were on their journey to search for product market fit? Was it like, for instance, you one of the slides show GrabHub was driving demand, and then they went to customers, to restaurants, right? Did they have 1,000 users, 5,000 users, 1 million users? Like, when was that tipping point that they say, hey, we have enough of one side that we can attract the other?
I see. So like, when do you decide you have enough of one side?
Especially when launch at the very beginning.
Yeah. That's a really good question. I think it just taps into this question of when do you know you have product market fit, which essentially one tells you when you should scale. Well, I guess there's two parts to it. There's like getting to product market fit, and then there's like how much supply do you need before you're ready for demand. I think the way I think about that is once you see kind of the flywheel start to work. So when you bring on demand, so say it's like GrabHub, how many restaurants do you need on GrabHub for it to be useful? I think you look at just kind of qualitative signals of the demand coming in, trying to use it, and is there a point at which it starts to kind of take off, where they book more often and kind of there's an inflection point, or they share good feedback, or there's an NPS score bump. So I think it depends a lot on the type of company and the type of business, like how many restaurants do you need versus how many homes do you need in a market versus how many taskers do you need. So I think the answer is you just look for some change in the behavior of the demand side. And like OpenTable was a good example. They found at 50 to 100 restaurants in a market, things change. It becomes effective. So I think it's the kind of thing you have to do, and then you start to see something shift. I hope that's useful.
Lenny, thank you for the presentation. It was great.
Thank you.
I had a question. When a company has developed a product / marketplace, what is a flag or metric that reflects a company is ready to diversify into similar services that they may offer? Say, do they have to wait until after they're geographically restricted? Are they statewide implemented?
So I think there's like expand into other services, which to me is starting like a new business line. Is that what you mean by that, or is it more scaling up? And
For example, Rover expanding
getting into dog walking.
Exactly.
Yeah, my understanding and looking at all the companies that I've talked to, usually you want to wait a long time to get into a whole new business line because there's so much to do to get it right and to build a really big business of any kind. And so if you start to distract yourself and start to do something completely different, it's usually a terrible idea. And Airbnb went through this process actually when I was joining. There's all this pressure on them to get into like Airbnb for dogs and Airbnb for boats and Airbnb for tents and all these things. And the founders kind of huddled and they kind of realized that there's so much depth in the travel industry still, and there's so many things they could make better in travel. And the way they approached it is they hired a storyboard artist from Pixar that came on as a full-time employee and drew the keyframes of a guest and a host journey on Airbnb, kind of like a story, like a movie. And it kind of pointed at all these key moments that we need to get better at to make Airbnb itself amazing, and that there's like years of work left to do just to make that better. And that kind of showed everyone we're not ready for anything else. So I think the Rover example, my take is it's kind of a rare example, where they look at it as like, hey, we should have done that early on. I'd say in the general case, you don't want to do that because it's very hard to get any kind of business operating. And the way there's this kind of concept of layers on the cake, which is as you build a business, it grows and grows and then eventually plateaus. And what you want to do is find another business line that all of a sudden starts to grow again at a high rate. And together they add up to a very high growth rate for the broader business. But that often comes later down the line. So my advice is you wait.
Thank you for the presentation. A lot of great info.
Thank you.
So marketplaces are inherently risky, right? So I was wondering if you knew if any of these companies at the beginning just kind of accepted the risks of what they were doing, or if they were doing anything beyond smart onboarding to actively address marketplace risk.
My take is a lot of the biggest companies wouldn't have happened if they knew how hard they were going to be or how risky it was or how impossible what they're trying to do is. So I think it was a combination of they had no idea how risky and challenging they're going to be, plus probably like, okay, let's just do this thing and figure it out as we go. There's a quote from Breather, Julian, the founder, that his learning about how to build a marketplace is you just do whatever you have to do to get it working. Just get on the street, onboard 1,000 people over Twitter, just figure it out. So that's kind of one takeaway. I don't know if that was your question.
Also on the liability side, because you're using people that you can't really control beyond onboarding them in an intelligent way, you can do background information and checks, and you can do smart questions like where does the dog sleep, but there's a certain part that you can never control. So at Airbnb, there's the quote about finally, at one point they were going to do $100,000 of liability insurance, and then they chose to do $1 million.
Right.
So at what point does that really become relevant? Because at the beginning, you can't really afford the $1 million of insurance, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that story is there was an incident on Airbnb where someone's apartment got trashed. It was the first time that it happened. And there's like a trending on Twitter, RIP Airbnb, it's over, no one's going to use it again. And the team, and this happened right before I joined, slept over in the office for 2 weeks, launching 80 different features to help make it a lot safer to use Airbnb, including the insurance policy. And they were about to launch it, I think, with I think it was maybe $10,000. And then Mark Andreessen came to the office just to check in on how things were going. And he's like, got to add a zero to that. And they're like, what? $100,000? And then they did that, and it worked out great. And then it's $1 million now. So I guess a couple things. One is a lot of these businesses, once they launch, learn that people are generally good, and that in most cases everything works out okay. And there's a sliver of times that it doesn't. And so you have to figure out how to solve those problems. And at scale, those numbers become bigger, and that becomes a more challenging problem.
Okay, I
But-
think we have time for like 2 questions. Oh, sorry.
I'll just add one quick thing that trust is a huge part of marketplace businesses, and I didn't cover any of that here, and that's something I'm going to spend time looking into more. But just like building trust, because you're interacting with a stranger, it's a very crazy thing to do, and so there's a lot of learnings around trust that I didn't even talk about.
Hi.
Hi.
My question is really quick. With product market fit, when you're trying to determine that for quintessential app or software service, I think right now the accepted norm is to, if the app went away tomorrow, would more than 40% of your users be upset about it? Now, I guess with this two-sided marketplace situation, do you have to do that on both sides to decide if you have product market fit?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You got to find 2 product market fits, which is crazy.
So I guess my follow-up question to that is, what if you have product market fit on one side and not the other?
Yeah.
What do you do in that situation?
Great question. So that's Patreon is a good example of that. They found a really amazing product for the supply side for the creators, and then turned out demand didn't want this thing. They didn't want to find creators to pay money to. So one option is you just cut off that side and just do the other thing. That's probably your best bet. Yeah. The other option is try to change the value prop or change it such that it's actually useful to people, but that's a reason these are really hard. Yeah.
Hey, thank you for the presentation. My question is, I would probably want to dive more in details to your Airbnb experience. I want to correlate the theory in terms of like their story. Like I remember they had like so much of that in credit card, and they almost want to give up. And I think they took this travel somewhere in New York, I think, and then they just spent time with one host and like get to know every host. And they said right after that it just like went viral, whatever. So my question is, it's easier said than done, but my question is, what was that bridge that flipped the switch? Like, like I co-founded before like a startup like related to like Airbnb at Tansler. We did everything. Like we scraped the entire Craigslist to get out the listing. We talked to property managers and did some PR, but it never really sparked the traction, and it went downhill after that. So is it more of like the story, or is it more of like the theory is there, the concept is there, but what really drives that traction, that spark that went viral right after that, if it's word of mouth?
I think that the answer is it's not any one thing. It's always going to be a combination of things that start to add up and work. So in the example of Airbnb, they just like spent a lot of time in New York talking to hosts, having meetups, bringing them on board one by one, taking photos of their homes, and eventually it started to click. And so it was like years. There was, I think, a period of 3 years. The first 3 years of Airbnb were just flat growth. Joe, one of the co-founders, put this graph on his mirror every day of where they wanted to be by the end of that week. And it was just always very flat, and then just started
So the story started from the host, and they word of mouth, so they promoted their own listings, I guess?
I think it was a combination of
everything, okay.
Combination word of mouth. They got some good PR with like their cereal box story, if you know about that. And then it was just like the cheapest way to travel. And once people started to hear about it, it was just like worth checking out. But a lot of that came from, their supply being there. And then I think press driving demand to Airbnb, and then started to spread through word of mouth again. But it wasn't a spark. It was just a bunch of lead bullets like we talked about.
Okay, really last question now.
Thank you for this. I think you presented on a lot of like famously large companies, but also famously unprofitable. Given the subsidies, the marketing, all of the promos that are required to build the marketplace, and then the competition that ensues after that, how do you build a moat or find that path to profitability?
Like I think those are different questions. How do you build a moat, and then like how do you build a real business that works? So I think you're right. A lot of these are too soon to say if they can make money long term. So that is a big question, and so we'll see. We could like look at this 5 years from now and be like, that was all worthless. This didn't actually work. I shouldn't have done that. But I think most likely they'll figure things out. I think there's a lot of smart people there, and they have a lot of incentive to crack this problem. And then I think the other part is how to build a moat. I think just being a marketplace creates a moat. I think that's one answer, because it's hard to, like, how do you compete with Uber now? They're just like in every market. They have all the supply. They have all this brand. People have the app. So that innately makes it really hard. So I think to build a moat, you just build something people are using. And then I think probably aggregating the supply first before anyone else is probably one of the more effective ways.
All right, big round of applause for Lenny.